What's the world gonna be in a year or two? What's it gonna be like for me and you? Will the men in power do what they need to do? What's the world gonna be like in a year or two? Seems like it's lost its mind again, this crazy world that we're living in, and we all give up and we all give in. Give us the truth, don't give us your lies, don't try to cut us down to your size. People are real, we all feel the pain when you lie to us again and again. Give us the truth. What's the world gonna be like in 20 years? Will we unite to save it before it all disappears? And the man at the top.
Good evening. For those of you who have been regulars on our webinar series, you will have become very familiar with our lead-in song, The Truth, written and sung by Rory Phillips. Rory is an amazing young man, and you can get to know him better through a surprise interview with Rotarian Rob Edwards at the conclusion of the Q&A section of this webinar. Definitely worth a look. My name is Guy Glennie from the Rotary Club of Sydney Cove, and a very warm welcome to our 7th quarterly Climate and Peace webinar. We're inspired to present these webinars because Rotary as a worldwide body has nominated climate and the environment as a priority area of focus. We link it to peace in particular, as we know that with warming climate, peace and security will be increasingly threatened, and we feel action is essential to preserve the planet for future generations. We believe our speakers tonight will address the very essence of these concerns, and we hope you will find this evening informative and fascinating, but with a very real hope that we can stem the tide of rising temperatures with concerted action around the globe. I'd like to acknowledge our event partners, and in particular those associated with tonight's speakers: the Climate Council, Australian National University, Macquarie University, Jane Goodall Institute Australia, Australian Security Leaders Climate Group, Idea Spies, and Better Futures Australia. If you'd like to know more about any of our partners, please click on the logos on our website. Thanks, Diego. Well, if you'd like to know more about Rotary, please contact any of the 150 Rotary clubs around the world shown on the map supporting our Climate and Peace Forum. They'd love to hear from you. Thanks, Diego. Well, it's now my great pleasure to welcome our chair for tonight's webinar, Rotarian Jeremy Wright, who with Rob Edwards is co-founder of our Climate and Peace Forum. He's also District Governor for this region of New South Wales, overseeing some 60 clubs. Welcome, Jeremy.
Guy, thank you very much. And thank you to our regular audiences and our new audiences to this, as Guy said, our 7th Climate and Peace webinar. I believe you're in for a treat. First, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we are on, in my case, the Wongal land of the Eora Nation, their elders past, present and emerging. And I'm sure you'll agree, First Nations people of all lands can teach us so much about positively managing country and the planet. As Guy said, we're from the Rotary Clubs of Sydney, namely Sydney Club, Sydney Cove, Darling Harbour, and with help from Corrimal Club. But we welcome you as Rotarians and non-Rotarians from around the world, many outside Australia, all colleagues wanting to know more about this issue. And as Guy said, Rotary as a worldwide body has embraced the environment and climate change. And tonight's webinar directly addresses the link between climate and peace. We've asked our speakers to address the theme, climate risks and making choices. and Professor Will Steffen will set the stage with his thoughts on planetary boundaries and tipping points. Admiral Chris Barrie AC will give an overview of the sovereign and security risks that we'll all face. And Zara Bending will enlighten us from the perspective of environmental law and also in the context of the eco-gender gap. And we will finish with a Q&A. Please contribute questions via the Q&A tab. We'll put as many to our speakers as we have time for and follow up others on our website blogs. Thank you for joining us tonight, and strap yourself in for what I believe will be an enthralling webinar. Guy, back to you to formally introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Well, our first speaker tonight is Professor Will Steffen, and he's Emeritus Professor, Fenner School of Environment and Society at the Australian National University. Will is a celebrated international global change researcher and is widely publicised on climate science. He has a broad range of interests in sustainability and Earth system science and is a co-founder of the Climate Council. Welcome, Will.
Thanks very much. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people on whose land I am sitting tonight and coming to you tonight. What I'd like to do, as scientists usually do, is sometimes called death by PowerPoint. So I'm going to try screen share and show you a few slides as we go through the science. So there we go. Let's see. Now you should be able to see my screen and the introductory slide, which is entitled The Climate Emergency, a term that we're using more and more in the scientific community, why we must act now. And of course, the background picture comes from my hometown of Canberra from January 2020. You can see the situation we were in there. But I want to go back to the last couple of years of 2019, 2020, and look at what was happening around our continent. Extreme heat, record-breaking heat in many of our capital cities. And on top of that, particularly in Queensland, massive flooding. And of course, we'll all remember the fires that plagued much of the East Coast during that time. But the statistics here are quite striking. The Black Summer fires burnt about 21% of eastern forests. On an average year, 2% burn. That is just extraordinary. Never happened before. We've killed half the hard corals on the Great Barrier Reef already, and more, unfortunately, will go. 2019 North Queensland floods, nearly $6 billion worth of damages, and our coastlines are being increasingly battered by huge swells and high tides, which are riding on rising sea levels. It's not only here, though, that's getting hammered. If you look around the world, our colleagues in Canada in 2021, last year, suffered a massive heat wave, the likes of which has never been seen in North America before. Temperatures reached nearly 50 degrees Celsius, and this is in Canada. They'd never seen anything close to that. Across the Atlantic in Europe, massive floods struck Central Europe, particularly Germany, wiping out virtually entire villages. So this is really now a climate that's getting out of control. Already in 2022, the impacts, the risks are massive. Well, let's now look at a bit of the science behind why all this is happening. This graph here is global average surface temperature for the last 2,000 years. So this goes back to the Roman Empire. Europeans first started coming to this continent somewhere around in this period. But you notice that all the temperature reconstructions in the past are virtually identical. Temperature only varied by about 1/10 of a degree. This black spike on the right-hand side, whoops, if I can get it, there we go. That is the human influence over the last 70, 80 years. In other words, we've pushed temperature out of that very, very narrow range of variability. It's now about 1.2 degrees above that historic average temperature, which is why we are seeing all these impacts that we are. One of the most striking pieces of evidence that I can give you, and still staggers me when I actually read this, is how fast these changes are occurring. We're pouring CO2 into the atmosphere, mainly through fossil fuel combustion. And over the past 2 decades, the rise in CO2 is about 100 times faster than the maximum rate during the last deglaciation about 20,000 to 12,000 years ago. That's when CO2 rose coming out of the last ice age. This is unprecedented in Earth history. In the last half century, the average temperature has been rising at a rate about 200 times the background rate over the last 7,000 years of the Holocene. This last statement, I think, is really important. These current rates of CO2 and temperature change are almost unprecedented in the entire history of this planet. That is 4.5 billion years. The only time that temperature changed this fast was 66 million years ago when the meteorite strike knocked the dinosaurs out. And at that time, the temperature went down. It was a cooling. So we can say now with confidence, we have never seen temperature rises this fast in the entire history of our planet, which is why we're seeing these extreme events, why we're seeing such a massive hit on the biosphere and so on. But I want to talk a little bit about what the real risks are that lie ahead of us. To me, the biggest one is this, is that a lot of changes in the Earth system are sort of what we call linear. You put more pressure on the system, it responds more. But there are some key parts of the Earth system which don't behave that way. But what we call tipping points. You can push these parts of the Earth system to a critical point, and then they take off on their own. They flip, they change. You can see what they are. They're big ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica, sea ice, permafrost, ocean circulation, and big natural ecosystems like the Amazon and the coral reefs. I've got 9 of them up there. You can read them. On all 9, they are starting to destabilize. And they're all destabilizing because of human pressures, most prominently climate change. Now, there are arrows drawn between them because they are linked. If you start melting Arctic sea ice, that increases the heating in the Northern Hemisphere. That causes more ice melt on Greenland. What does that do? Pours fresh water onto the North Atlantic, slows down the circulation, and that reduces the rainfall in the Amazon. So melting ice in the Arctic is leading to drought in the Amazon. But if we get all of these going over like a row of dominoes, the game is over. There is no way we will be able to retrieve a stable Earth system, at least in any reasonable lifetimes ahead. So this is the real risk that we face. And we're pretty clear about it. We say if damaging tipping cascades can occur, and we know they can, and a global tipping point cannot be ruled out, then this is an existential threat to our civilization. You can forget about economic cost-benefit analysis. It doesn't matter. It isn't going to help us. So this is what we have to absolutely avoid at all costs. So the question is, how close are we to that? We're pretty certain if we keep temperature rise to below 1.5, we will probably not initiate a tipping cascade. The more we go over that and the closer we get to 2, the more dangerous it comes. And I think the further we go over 2, and we're on track to do that now, the game's going to be over. These are some strong words that are taken from the IPCC AR6 from Simon Bradshaw. The most important climate science update for almost a decade shows we're on a very narrow path to avoiding climate catastrophe, but only through immediate and sustained emission reductions. And I can tell you as a scientist, this could be our final warning. The next time we come back to you, we're going to say it's too late, batten down the hatches because you're going to have a really rough ride. As I showed, climate change is already wreaking havoc around the world with worse to come. But the decisions this decade, and this is the last decade we've got to make the right decisions. It's this decade that's going to make the difference between a livable planet for today's young people or a future that is incompatible with well-functioning human societies. That is collapse. But every choice we make now, every fraction of a degree we can hold that temperature down is going to be important. So the right choices we make between now and the end of this decade will be measured in lives, livelihoods, species, ecosystems. No time for dithering around. We have to act now. I'll close by what we need to do in a practical sense. And that is, of course, getting CO2 emissions down. By far, the bulk of CO2 emissions, 90% of them, come from burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. This is the record from 1960. You can see that emissions have gone steadily up, a few little bumps here and there. Here was the COVID pandemic, which dropped emissions by about 5% or so. But notice that in 2021, we've rebounded to virtually the same level of emissions as prior to COVID. We've lost a huge opportunity to start the emissions on the downward track. Our economic bounce back has been a disaster in terms of the climate. So this is what we need to do to stabilize the climate. We need to get to net zero. certainly before the middle of the century. These colored lines are actually sensitive to the year in which you peak emissions. Had we been able to peak emissions in 2016, we would have to 2045 to reach net zero. That was 30 years, and you could do it. 2020, it looks like we've missed 2020. We could have peaked with COVID, but we didn't. That would have allowed us to hit net zero by 2040. Here's our problem. We are now probably likely to keep increasing emissions to 2025. We got to follow the red line. That means a 75% reduction by 2030. This is a crisis situation. We have to throw everything else, every other consideration out the window and get emissions down. And we have to hit net zero by 2035. That's in 10 years. That is exceptionally difficult to do. So this is the climate emergency. We're no longer at 2020. We didn't peak there. We're at 2022. And by all accounts, projections are emissions will go up in 2022. That gives us only 3 years before we peak and then have to get emissions down to net zero by 2035. If we don't do that, we are at big risk of losing control of the climate system. So what do we need to do in a very practical sense, in my view? One, from today, now, no new fossil fuel developments of any kind anywhere, coal, oil, and gas. Now, you might say, well, this is just a radical climate scientist saying this. Well, that's not true. The International Energy Agency, the peak body for the energy sector, has said exactly the same thing in their most recent report. No new fossil fuel developments, no new Adani mine, no new other coal mines, no new gas fields. We have to put the foot down now and say, stop. And that must occur immediately. As I said before, by 2030, we must have a 75% reduction. It's really tough, but we could do it. Key to it is 100% renewable energy. We can definitely do that. The technologies are there. It's economically viable. We've got to get the policy settings in place to do it. And 2035, reach net zero emissions. I'll give the last word to the students. We started this webinar tonight with a young person from Tumut singing that quite nice song. I'm going to end with young people outside of the Parliament House here in Canberra. And it's their future that's on stake. It's not my future. I'm an old bloke. I'm not going to see the worst of climate change, but it's my daughter's future, and it's her children's future, and it's these people's future. That's what we have to stand up and protect. And that's why we've got to meet the climate crisis, the climate emergency now. Thanks very much for your attention. Looking forward to a Q&A later in the evening.
Many thanks, Will, for setting the scene and for those very challenging statistics. The late Holocene baseline shows very dramatically the human impacts on the climate, and the global tipping cascade shows the tremendous risks we face and the need to reduce global emissions 75% by 2030. Well, our second speaker is Admiral Chris Barrie, AC, who after 42 years in the Royal Australian Navy, including 4 years as Chief of Defence Force, is now Adjunct Professor Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. Chris is a strong advocate on the risks of climate change to national security and a member of the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change. Welcome, Chris.
Could ask him to Chris, can you check your sound, please? Thank you.
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
All right, let's go back to the start. I just wanted to hold up my carbon dioxide monitor and say before we start, it is now on 1,070 parts per million. That's in this room. And what that says is that my cognitive function is now reduced by 15%. So climate change and the consequences of global warming are affecting us all. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people on whose land I'm also making this presentation, and also to acknowledge Will Steffen, who on one hand is totally responsible for getting me involved in the subject matter, and with whom I've worked over many years now, trying to get change implemented throughout our country. 20 years ago, I retired from full-time service, and the last 4 years was as the Chief of the Defence Force. It was under my leadership that Australia, for the first time in its history, led a multinational United Nations mandated coalition force on operations to provide security in East Timor in 1999. And later, I commanded the first responses to 9/11, including the initial deployment into Afghanistan that lasted less than a year. So when I'm looking at issues of security risks and climate change, I bring to bear nearly 42 years of experience in thinking about how we might deal with the challenges that are in front of us. And they are very much in front of us, as you've just heard. But what concerns me is that our recent record shows we have not been prepared properly for the challenges that have stared us in the face and are going to stare us in the face in the future. I think our national responses to the Black Summer of bushfires, followed by the extensive floods and now the last 2 years over the COVID-19 pandemic, are examples of how we could have done a lot better had we been properly prepared. In 2011, when I was working with Will Steffen and the Climate Commission, we together launched a publication headlined as The Critical Decade. And in short, it summarised the state of scientific knowledge about global warming at the time and established a case that we needed to act over the next 10 years to limit greenhouse gas emissions and decarbonise our economies. It's now 11 years later, and we've made very little progress in achieving the outcomes we aspired to back then. But the truth is, the time to have a measured response to do things has now run out. And it is my view, and the view of the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group, that in 2022, we have to choose. We can do nothing and let events unfold as they have been and as they might in the future. We can try to clean up the mess that's been created through the consequences of global warming. Or we can decide that urgent emergency action is needed without any delay to equip us with the tools and the processes we need to deal with the consequences of global warming. This question of choice is a focus for this webinar. And I hope I can explain why I think we have to take that drastic action now to minimise to the fullest extent possible the use of fossil fuels and to decarbonise. We have to think sustainability and not growth. The alternative is to seriously undermine the quality of the life of our children and grandchildren in their future, not mine. I find it curious that in most discussions concerning climate risks right now and the consequences of global warming, we seem to forget about the elephant in the room. Let me explain about the elephant in the room and why it is so important. I'm speaking here about the growth in global population. At present, we think there are about 7.5 billion human beings on the planet. According to the United Nations estimates, in 2050 or so, there will be nearly 10 billion human beings on the planet. And that means that between now and then, the population burden is going to increase by about 25%. The problem is that every one of these human beings, now I call human beings a predatory species, will consume resources, that is food, water, building materials, and energy, irrespective of where they live. As well, this increase in population will lead to a greater densification in many parts of the world with consequences for health systems in a warming environment. So let me turn to some facts in our part of the world. The combination of an increasing population burden and global warming will make it impossible to hold the growth of global average temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, as Will has said. If we are lucky, and we do act this year, we may land closer to that figure, but also requiring us to take drastic action over the next 10 months. My own assessment is that we're almost certainly going into a 2 degrees Celsius environment about which we have not as much modelling as we should to show what this might mean for all of us. I hope you can see why that in 2018, in my evidence to a Senate inquiry into climate change and security, I described the consequences of human-based global warming as presenting an existential threat to human life on the planet. I made a contrast between this threat and the threat presented by nuclear war. In the case of nuclear war, few of us will play a role in the decisions and execution required, but we will all be affected over a very short period of time. A couple of months or so at best. In the case of climate change, the consequences may take decades to unfold, and they will make life very uncertain and lacking in much quality. But the eventual outcome will not be very different. As I look at this picture ahead, I conceive of significant insecurities that will play out in different ways depending on location, on weather, our preparedness, and luck. Especially when you think about some of the issues that can go seriously wrong. I'm not going to have time to lay out a full case in any detail, but I think it is useful to think about significant insecurities that might be attached to food, water, our health, extreme weather events, and natural disasters. We've already heard about tipping points, and you know what that looks like, and we've felt it over the last few years. And we've seen the impact of these issues on global supply chain and the consequences that that's had on just-in-time systems that we've built to manage ourselves. So let's think briefly about some of the insecurities. In food, some estimates of 2050 are telling us that food production on the planet may be reduced by up to 50%. We think that's important? Well, I do. If I look into history, it's replete with examples of what happens when people starve. Think of the storming of the Bastille. It wasn't about Marie Antoinette, it was about potatoes. Think about the Russian Revolution, which had its roots in the starving soldiers in Imperial Russia. And think about what's been happening in Syria, in the Arab Spring, and the flow-on consequences. Turning to water insecurity for a minute. We have enough trouble in this country squabbling over the Murray-Darling Basin system. And I've been at conferences where internationally people have been squabbling over what happens to the flows in the Mekong River. And in 2016, the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change published a document that tried to outline what was going to happen with the disappearance of the Himalayan glacier up high in the Himalayas and with consequences to reliable freshwater flows throughout Asia and South Asia, including significant countries with populations over 1.5 billion people. Turning now to health insecurities, we've seen over the last 2 years the consequences of a global pandemic. Some of that has already been predicted, and I have a book in my office which talks about the consequences of a potential pandemic written 15 years ago. And guess what? It looks a lot like the story that's unfolded over the last 2 years. On extreme weather events, I talk about cyclones, I talk about rainfalls, I talk about droughts and all those kinds of things. And finally, on natural disasters, as the volcano in Tonga reminds us, we should never forget that planet Earth does have a way of fighting back in ways that we can't predict. So putting this all together, it builds a comprehensive picture of what lies ahead. And I do not think conceptually we have very much idea of what might happen unless we take that drastic action that Will and I are talking about. Putting on my hat as a war gamer, I would say that we could write many scenarios about the kinds of possibilities future generations might have to experience. Indeed, I've drawn up 3 of them here for tonight, so you can go away and think about it later. Scenario 1. Let us imagine that as a consequence of warming and densification, an emerging viral contagion begins to infect the world. But this contagion has not yet been controlled. It's very infectious and transmissible by aerosol and contact means. In the human body, its effects mirror an Ebola-like disease, a hemorrhagic breakdown of the organs, resulting in certain death. In Australia, on one Sunday afternoon, 30,000 of our citizens had died in the preceding 24 hours. The government of the day declared a state of national quarantine in order to restrict new infections as much as possible. People had to stay at home. No one could go to work. No one could go shopping, but that didn't matter because the shops were all closed. After a couple of days, our utility services began to fail. Our water supply became uncertain. Electricity was also affected, and many people began to run out of food. Now, this game has been played out a number of times, not just in Australia. It's been played out overseas too. And it's interesting to consider what it might mean if this was to happen. For example, people living in high-rise buildings are now in very serious trouble. No lifts work. There is no water. Communications have failed, and people are getting very angry and upset. In the face of this pandemic, our governance systems are threatened, and the thin veneer of civilization begins to collapse. Turning now to scenario number 2. Imagine that you live in Brisbane. Imagine that Australia has been buffeted by a succession of Category 5 cyclones over the last 3 months. There has been extensive damage along the Queensland coast in the north and in the Gulf region and in northwest Australia. Cyclone Stella is forming well to the south of the old cyclone maps. It is being created by the heating of the sea, and meteorologists are suggesting that Brisbane may experience its first Category 5 cyclone in living memory. We know that storms like this contain huge amounts of energy and are exceedingly destructive. There are parts of the world that experience these kinds of storms over many years. But Brisbane is not such a place. The problem we now confront is the prospect of a repeat of Cyclone Tracy in a very much bigger city than Darwin in 1975. Most buildings in Brisbane are not constructed to cyclone standards. And to date, we have done nothing to deal with these legacy systems as we should have done, but by now it is too late. There will be a storm surge of 1.5 to 2 metres over the high tide that extends up the Brisbane River as well. There will be massive damage created and large numbers of people will lose their lives. I leave it for you to imagine what will this look like when you think about Cyclone Tracy being a much smaller event. Scenario 3. Australia has done very little to change its planetary footprint. Population densities are the smallest in the world, about 5 per square kilometre. The population in Australia is 2050, and our population is about 39 million people. In Australia's region, we have close to 6 billion people, and it's much more densely populated. For example, in Indonesia, the population will be at 330 million people, and the economy will be about 6 times that of Australia's. But in Bangladesh, the impact of food and water insecurities, coupled with an increase in sea level by over 0.5 metre, has created a huge potential for mass migrations. Over 70 million people in Bangladesh are now looking for a new home. They have seen that Australia has accommodated some people from Pacific Island countries whose land disappeared under the waves. Many of these people in Bangladesh are not interested in moving internally or towards adjoining countries because there would be no change in the basic drivers that have affected their lives. Instead, these people are creating the potential for a mass migration towards Australia that is seen as a land with plenty of space and the resources needed to provide some quality of life. And it's a question about how we might respond to such an event and how we might look at history in Europe that has experienced such early signs of mass migrations to think about what we might do in the face of the fact that so many people want to come here. Now, 10 years ago, when these scenarios were put out, it didn't seem possible that they could be happening in my lifetime. But now, as I look back, it's clear that the challenges we're now going to confront are significant, and they will have a direct impact on our human security. And it's also clear that events that occur in our home country will have an impact as well as events taking place elsewhere. So let me go back to where I started my pitch. I spoke about the choices we now have to make, and I urged people to think about the urgency of the situation. There is so much evidence that time has run out, and if we do not act this year, I reckon we are likely to find next year might be too late. Of course, I recognise that many of us feel a sense of comfort by the lag effects in the climate system. This is because current greenhouse gas emissions take some time to act on the system. But the evidence over the last few years is that our comfort zone is under attack much more frequently and earlier than expected. All of us, that is all of us on planet Earth, have to take action. We must take action in our homes and we must change our behaviours. We have to work at community and regional levels to look after each other and anticipate what we need to do to provide for our security. We also have to ensure that our leadership at the 3 levels of government is setting an example through behaviour and the setting of a change agenda to prepare ourselves at all levels to work together in coordinating the effort to reduce climate risks to an acceptable level through mitigation and adaptation. And that's why In our Missing in Action report, the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group recommended the conduct of an urgent climate and security risk assessment conducted independently and to canvass all aspects of Australian life. We recommended the establishment of a dedicated Office of Climate Threat Intelligence and a triennial National Climate Risk Assessment to measure trends. And finally, we want to see the building of an Australian National Prevention and Resilience Framework. The truth is we haven't done nearly enough to date, and we have to use all the means at our disposal to create a national resilience footprint, and that we must demand that leadership sets an aggressive agenda for change. We cannot be blind and think we've done nearly enough to date. Our future generations of Australians may well hold all of us to account for our failures to grapple with the changes that are needed for Australia to survive. So thank you very much, and I look forward now to hearing from Zara.
Well, many thanks, Chris, for your candid observations that the time for a measured response has run out and that the question of choice is critical. We have to choose sustainability and not growth, including consideration to global population growth and the impact of that on food and water resources. The comparison of climate change with nuclear war is very chilling, and the scenarios you highlight are a clarion call for urgent action. Well, our final speaker is Zara Bending, and she's an associate at the Centre for Environmental Law at Macquarie University. She is a recognised anti-wildlife trafficking expert of the Jane Goodall Institute Global, and regularly appears as an expert witness before parliamentary inquiries and in criminal matters. Her expertise encompasses the imperatives of maintaining species diversity in the natural world and the role of gender bias in environmental and climate outcomes. Welcome, Zara.
Thank you. So good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everyone. I can see that we have an international audience in tonight. I'm joining you all from Gadigal country, and honestly couldn't be more thrilled to join my brother panelists tonight, Professor Steffen and Admiral Barrie. So a hearty thank you to Rotary Clubs of Sydney for assembling this lineup. I'm going to try to keep my contribution a bit looser, and my aim is to really offer some insights from my work in 3 parts with 3 key messages. Firstly, the impacts of climate change are ubiquitous. Secondly, that when we talk about climate change, representation matters. And thirdly, bringing it back to our overarching theme of tonight, we need to make informed choices and choose to act now. So let's start with our first key message, that the impacts of climate change are ubiquitous. Now, climate change affects all of us and acts as a force multiplier for other challenges facing our species and the array of other species with which we share this planet. Mass extinction, food insecurity, public health, including disease spillover, shifts in populations, human to human and human wildlife conflict. And of course, from a more human-centered point of view, it affects markets, economies, and livelihoods, both legal and not so legal. I'll speak to my experience here because having been an illegal wildlife trade researcher for the last decade, you honestly wouldn't believe the ways that climate change is now an embedded part of my day-to-day work. So here's a quick 4-point taster. Firstly, climate change is affecting the commodities that find their way into legal and illicit markets. And mammoth ivory is one such example. I'll call back to Professor Steffen's reference to permafrost here. As the climate emergency melts permafrost in the Siberian tundra, preserved mammoths bearing tusks as long as a few meters are unearthed, and when cut into small pieces are virtually indistinguishable from elephant ivory to the naked eye, which presents a range of ethical and legal questions because ivory from newly poached elephants could be passed off as mammoth to get around international and local laws. And conversely, mammoth ivory could be feeding some parts, not all, but some parts of the elephant ivory market, despite efforts to enforce bans and change attitudes in key consumer countries. Secondly, climate change is allowing invasive plants to grow, affecting food webs and the abundance of already endangered plants, including highly trafficked orchids. In fact, climate change is rapidly becoming the greatest threat to plants and may well drive, by some estimates, 15 to 37% of all taxa to extinction by 2050, including 56,000 endemic plant species in biodiversity hotspots. Thirdly, climate change is affecting breeding, which compromises species survival. Now, you may be familiar with the sea turtle example, where warmer temperatures and nests can not only kill off hatchlings, but skews gender to produce females. But another lesser known example are cheetahs, where warmer temperatures have lowered testosterone and viable sperm count in males. Now, this is a concern because cheetahs are highly trafficked online to meet the exotic pet markets of places like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. To give you a sense, we have fewer than 7,000 cheetahs left in the wild. They occupy only 10% of their historical range in Africa. And we have a single, very isolated group of 50 Asiatic cheetahs in Iran. Yet at least 4,184 cheetahs have been trafficked through online sales since 2009, and they don't breed well in captivity. We are losing them, and as the climate emergency compromises their baseline for survival in the wild, it only increases the potential profits for organized crime involved. Because unfortunately, the rarer something is, the more people are willing to pay. And that includes a lot of corruption along supply chains. And fourthly, because it's something that I can't not tell everyone about, climate change is affecting migratory species who rely on multiple suitable habitats to survive. In the European eel's case, this means hatching in the Atlantic Ocean, drifting along currents towards Europe and North Africa, then to continental waters to grow before returning to the oceans to spawn. And before you think who cares about eels, I put to you that the transnational eel cartels are running an annual $3.3 billion black market industry, promising a return on investment greater than drugs or armed trafficking by some measures. This is serious organized crime presenting tangible threats to national security, biosecurity, and the rule of law. Now, these are a few of the impacts and examples of where climate change is magnifying the impacts of mass extinction and wildlife crime in my work. But I guarantee that if you take a moment to reflect on your day-to-day, what you consume, the places and species that you love, your livelihood, or that of your friends and family, you will find that these links hit close to home because the impacts of climate change are ubiquitous. But let's explore that premise further. While climate change affects all of us, what we can't escape is that it is having a disproportionate impact on certain groups based on geographic and demographic factors, which leads to my second key message, that when we talk about climate change, representation matters. If we look at the intersection of gender and climate, for example, there are a few interesting threads to consider. Now, some of you may have heard of the term eco-gender gap and how there appears to be greater prevalence of eco-anxiety and amongst women and girls compared to their male counterparts. Women and girls are also more likely, empirically, to advocate for environmental issues. Now, from my experience being in conservation for over a decade, sitting on the board of the Jane Goodall Institute in Australia, and working with colleagues from around the world, it certainly began to interest me as to why this was. Now, we talk a lot about how attitudes to environmental issues begin at home, a lot of it around what and how we consume, but also our attitudes towards nature through upbringing. I remember reading some research conducted by a firm called Mintel that went so far as to suggest that green branding, green branding of products, and I suppose by extension, eco-conscious ideas may as well be pink branding because of how this marketing targets women. The logic being that women are the nurturers who have primary carriage in domestic life. Now, this certainly assumes a certain type of household structure, and I suppose one of my concerns is that it may be setting up a paradigm where the mental and emotional load of climate action is just another form of invisible women's work when all of us should be sharing that load. And to sort of add insult to injury, there's a saying that it doesn't take much to be considered a difficult woman. That's why there are so many of us. I happily take the compliment, but it's disheartening to see so many women mobilizing climate action being undermined by politics as usual. Remember, there's no requirement of prior specialized knowledge to become a politician or decision maker in many cases. So seeing environments where men with no technical understanding of climate science, just talking down to women who have actual academic backgrounds, seeking to inform law and policy, even calling them hysterical, is as sexist as it is incredibly reckless. And look, it's wonderful to see so many women and girls and allies creating spaces and leading efforts to get laws and policies changed. But oftentimes we're having to convince a room of men of a particular socio-economic class who refuse to listen or relate. The average representation of women in national and global climate negotiating bodies in 2015 was below 30%. And the situation isn't much improved, just Google photos from COP26. On that note, on top of that, oftentimes there's just a blind spot when it comes to how climate change is affecting women and girls at the intersection of other categories that may affect their vulnerability. When I say other categories, these could be women and girls facing hardship due to ethnicity, class, sexuality, religion, nationality, actual or perceived disability, age, whether they live metro or rural. Those sorts of things depending upon where in the world we're looking at. Research by UN Women and the World Bank indicates that women are more likely to live in poverty than men, so are less likely to escape and bounce back from climate change related disasters. And sadly, when food, clean water, firewood and shelter are scarce due to drought or deforestation, for example, women and girls can find themselves in situations of extreme duress and coercion to survive, including forced marriage, including being trafficked, and other forms of violence. And that's what can happen to the survivors when we know that women and children are 14 times more likely than men to die in a disaster. Now, that last point in particular hits home for me as an Aussie who, like many of you, loves the beach, loves the water, and maybe takes for granted just how lucky we are to live in a country where children learn to swim. My first proper job actually as a teen was being a learn to swim teacher. But my mother is from the Philippines, a country that routinely experiences typhoons and monsoons, and these are getting worse. But she, like most women, didn't grow up learning to swim. In fact, drowning is the third leading cause of unintentional death worldwide, and 96% of drowning deaths occur in low to middle income countries, where on top of that, women are far less likely than men to have basic water safety skills. So I guess our second key message tonight, that representation matters when we talk about climate change, has two prongs. Firstly, we all need to share in the load of climate action. And secondly, we need to acknowledge and act on, not undermine, the expertise and experiences of women as part of mapping out inclusive solutions. Imagine what we could accomplish if we did. Which leads to my final key message tonight. We need to make informed choices and we need to choose to act now. Certainly, at the household level, there are changes that we can make to reduce our carbon footprint. But there are other choices we can make around our dinner tables, in our workplaces, businesses, councils, schools, boards, clubs, and community groups that can move us together towards the larger scale change that needs to happen. Be relentless. Make public submissions to parliamentary inquiries. Call out businesses who aren't taking action, but also thank the ones who are. Share accurate climate data and commentary. Stay on your representatives beyond holding them accountable each election cycle. We don't have the time. We have an incredible amount of discretion in environmental and planning law that is exercised in a manner that is in no way representative of what constituents value. Write letters to the editor. Sign your kids and grandkids up to workshops connecting them to nature so they understand what we stand to lose and why it's worth protecting. We run a number at JGI Australia and through Roots and Shoots around the world. Plug into and create spaces just like this today, where we can have these conversations and then bring those conversations with you everywhere, from the kitchen table to the boardroom and beyond, and make sure that everyone shares in that dialogue. On the issue of gender and climate, please choose to be inclusive in the perspectives that you bring forward. There are a diversity of impacts, so we need a diversity of voices represented. Now, Greta Thunberg gets a lot of coverage, but there are many others from around the world whose voices need to break through, and you may choose to look them up after this talk. So here are a few, and I will drop them in the chat. Artemisa Jacriba of Brazil, Ritima Pandey of India, Vanessa Nakate from Uganda, Anne-Marie Raduva from the Pacific Islands, Isra Hersey from the US, Taylor Clark from Gundungurra country, Grace Vegasana from the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, and Dr. Kim Liu from Doctors for the Environment Australia. Also consider organizations and supporting organizations that help keep girls in school and empowered when it comes to their job prospects and reproductive health. Because when we facilitate that, we see women choosing to have fewer children and devoting their efforts to raising up their communities and participating in public life. That's part of the conversation about stemming overpopulation Admiral Barrie noted earlier. I'm going to close off with one intergenerational example, an exchange from my work that has fundamentally changed how I approach my advocacy. There was a point this pandemic where, like many of you, I was overwhelmed. And honestly, I felt like the expert in every Hollywood disaster film that the politicians never listen to before disaster strikes. I think my fellow panelists know the feeling well. I was in a Zoom with two incredible women over 70, and I asked the dreaded question, "How are you?" I answered honestly. I said, "I'm exhausted, and it feels like I have the weight of the world on my shoulders." Without skipping a beat, one of them replied completely deadpan, "It is. Now what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do?" It may sound harsh, but it was the most motivating thing I needed to hear, because we can't continue on with business as usual. We can't be stuck having the same conversations that result in inaction and political cowardice. And as much as we may want to from a place of love, we can't shield our children and grandchildren from climate change by pretending it doesn't exist. I'll draw from Dr. Jane Goodall here. We don't inherit this planet from our parents, we borrow it from our children. But right now, we aren't borrowing, we're stealing their future. But we have a window of time and we have choices to make. So I'm paying it forward right now and putting it to everyone listening right now. After this Zoom ends and your devices are switched off, when everything that you've heard tonight has sunk in and registered, what are you going to do? Thank you for having me tonight.
Gosh, many thanks, Zara, for the three aspects of climate change. It's ubiquitous on all aspects of life, including illegal commodities trading, mass extinctions, and corruption of supply chains. And it's having a disproportionate impact on certain groups, particularly women and girls who are taking a particularly large share of the burden of climate threats. And representation matters. We need to make informed choices and act now. And we must be relentless in calling for action and listen to diverse voices. Well, we now have the Q&A section of our webinar hosted by Jeremy Wright. As noted earlier, if you wish to ask a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens and enter questions there. We'll try to get to as many as possible, but if we cannot answer all the questions during the webinar, we will invite our speakers to respond afterwards and include our responses in the blog section of our website. Over to you, Jeremy.
Guy, thank you very much. And thank you to the our three speakers for fantastic presentations. If you've been watching the chat, our audience have been most appreciative of the information and the passion that you've shown. I'm going to go backwards in terms of asking questions to Zara first, then back through Chris and to Will, because a number of questions came about how we can better support young people who may otherwise be disengaged by a lot of this information. And Zara, you provided terrific examples in terms of how we support our women folk and encourage our women folk. I'd ask you, do you have ideas about how we can support our young people?
Well, look, I teach around 1,000 young law and criminology students a year, and I think it's hard on the one sense, they're being told that they're lazy and unmotivated, and on the other hand, that they're speaking too much, that they're being too loud, stay in school, keep your voices down. I think, honestly, we need to inculcate a culture in our young people that we want them to care. Caring is good. We want to see moxie. And sometimes that counts more than a perfect record in school. I certainly do that when I recruit. But I actually want to speak quickly to the older people in the room. I usually speak to younger people, but directly to you. You all actually have a resource that our young people need to move this conversation forward. It's your lived experience. They don't have that. You have albums, newspaper clippings, you have your own observations of how life has changed. Share that with us, have those conversations. And then I think if our young people and our older population, growing voting bloc in Australia got together, we could accomplish so much in a very quick space of time. Election upcoming, of course.
Zara, thank you. Fantastic. So, Admiral Barrie, Chris, if I could pose this question to you, and you raised the issue of population, and that was very welcomed on our chat room. In contrast to that, the question has come: how do we look at population and equity? And shouldn't it be, or can it be, the responsibility surely of the developed countries who've used all the carbon up to now, versus the population issue? And there's a related question to that, to Zara, linked to the ethics of controlling population. But Chris, if you'd address the equity issue first.
All right, Jeremy. Well, look, the whole concept of controlling population is very, very difficult. People will remember the one-child policy in China and how that backfired on people. And when I first raised this at the Australian Leadership Retreat over 10 years ago, I did some inquiry, and of course, as I think has come out in the chat room, the best way of controlling or managing population growth is through the education of women and making women's lives much better than they are, and certainly not treating women as chattels and things to be traded. So, by liberating women from those kinds of scenarios, you can do a lot. It's very interesting when you look at the developed countries and those countries in which populations are declining. China itself is going to go through a small decline in population, but in India, that's not going to happen. And of course, if you look into Africa, it looks really very interesting. And I think we need to be investing seriously in trying to achieve better outcomes in Africa than we've done to date. Where do we get to after all of this? I think it is a question of equity. I think it is it's burden sharing. I think that women are very much as part of this as men. I found it very interesting in the last 6 months talking to the independents in the Parliament about our issues in the climate change and security agenda. Let me tell you, those women independents, they're like that. They're all together. They talk to each other all the time. And so I would say to any one of you that if you wanted to hasten the change in this country, make sure before you cast your vote at the next election, you make your vote count, by testing all the candidates for their position on the essential ingredients of climate change management. Find out what they are on about and make it clear if they're not going to do it properly, they're not going to get your vote. We live in a country of a compulsory vote. It's a wonderful thing to be able to exercise, but it requires us to make votes count.
Chris, thank you. Zara, just any short comment on the ethics of population control?
Again, things like one-child policies are a very blunt instrument, and we've seen the fallout of that, as Admiral Barrie has mentioned. Again, what could be so wrong about educating women? And to further add this point, women, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, women belong in all the places where decisions are being made. It shouldn't be the exception. So we need to move towards raising up and building capacity rather than trying to diminish it.
Thank you, Zara. So, Will, I got a question that came to me before the webinar started, and it relates to what you said. Every fraction of a degree is important that we try and limit. If that inspires us to do more, then that's a good thing. If COP26 saw a small change in world sentiment, what do you hope will bring a big change in world sentiment positively?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I'm probably not as optimistic about COP26 as a lot of people, because it seems like we've bounced back in a very bad way to the old ways of doing things. And sort of 3 months down the track now, most people are forgetting about Glasgow and saying, oh, we need to get the economy boosted again. US is having problems with higher petrol prices, so let's pump some more oil out. You know, all this short-termism, which is actually leading to quite a burst of emissions just now. I think we have to think, just as my two colleagues have said, you've got to act now, you've got to act consistently, you've got to act with a long-term perspective. So that's what we have to do. And that's why I think more and more of us scientists, who tend to be fairly conservative type people, are using the word climate emergency, the fact that we are in a crisis, the fact that we don't know for sure where those tipping points lie. The more you drive temperature up, the higher risk you've got. And I'll close my response with a comment from a very good colleague of mine, Carlos Nobre from Brazil, who works on the Amazon basin. And someone asked him, they said, Carlos, we know there's a tipping point in the Amazon forest. Can you tell me where it lies? And he said, no. He said, the only way I can tell you for sure where that tipping point lies is by tipping it. And then he said, that's not a very intelligent thing to do. So we're going to have to learn to use a risk approach and a risk-averse approach if we want to get on top of this.
Well, thank you. So I'll go back to Zara, but this might be a question for the three panelists. We've had a couple of questions about climate change in relation to the pandemic, its relationship, which Will covered in terms of the carbon emissions, but also the future prospects of further pandemics caused by climate change. I know there's been comments about other health issues. Might you comment on what we hear about in terms of out of jungles and so on, and the mix between humans and species about future pandemics?
Yes, well, I've been very privileged to kind of oversee our institute's work through the Coalition to End Pandemics at Source. And as you have this mass movement of people and encroachment into wild areas, the propensity to have disease spillover increases. And there was a study by the IPBS some years ago, estimating some 1.7 million undiscovered viruses thought to exist in wild animals, of which approximately half could spill over into humans. So we need to completely reassess our relationship with nature at this juncture, and hopefully inculcate a One Health approach to things like wildlife trade, and also crack down on illicit trade, where many of these diseases come from.
Will, can I ask any small comment or short comment from you about that?
Yeah, look, I think I would say that in this case, climate change might just be an exacerbating factor. I think what Zara has said is really important, is that to me, more as an Earth system scientist, the big thing is biosphere degradation, interference with the biosphere, and so on by humans. That's the number one driver of changes. I think that became clear out of the IPBES report. But climate change is an exacerbating factor because species that are under pressure from direct human actions, many of them are seeing their habitats change, and they may have to try to move out of some place that's still relatively intact through some sort of corridor or through to some zone which is dominated by humans. So it just makes matters worse. But I would agree with Zara that the number one issue is we've got to control ourselves and our interaction with the rest of the living world. That's a huge priority.
Thank you. Chris,
The final issue on this question is densification. We've seen with COVID-19 that the variants have come out of human to human contact. You look at the densification issues of 2050, most of us probably don't know which will be the most dense country on the planet, but it's going to be Singapore at about 9,291 people per square kilometre. Bangladesh is 1,370 persons per square kilometre. In Australia, there'll be 5. Now, of course, you can look elsewhere in our region. India at 519, or the Philippines very close at 495. Even Indonesia will just be 169. But the point I'm raising here is if you add densification, lots of human beings, and a warming climate, it is a recipe for new viral pandemics.
Chris, thank you. Let me continue with you. Slightly different question, not slightly different, big question. As an individual who has rubbed shoulders with world leaders, what can be done to strengthen the UN and have the superpowers work together in the interests of all rather than the few? A big question.
Well, the first part of the question is about the United Nations, and I'll take that one because I know a little bit about that. The current Secretary General has a reform process going on in the UN. They've managed to achieve what I call picking the low-hanging fruit, but on the agenda for change to be conducted over the next 2 to 3 years is reform of the UN Security Council and changing the way in which some of the UN agencies work. And as you've heard Antonio Guterres, he is very focused on climate change and potential consequences. Now, I, for one, am a little sceptical that the reform process will go as far as they would like it to. When I look at current world events and we look, for example, at what's going on in Ukraine, et cetera, we say to ourselves, what's really changed? I mean, I think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis and ask myself, why is this different to what happened there? It's just the big player is different. Or what happened when Hitler decided to invade Eastern Europe. All that same sort of stuff being played out again. And for what purpose is a really big question. And I think this comes back, I suppose, to what I think is an essential question, even in this country. How do we make our leaders and hold them to account for what they do? Do we need an accountability court to be able to trail in front of the court in years to come by younger generations to say, when you were Tony Abbott and you were running this country, what did you do? You dismantled the Climate Commission. You created the Climate Council out of their good offices, but you did everything you could to shut it down. We're holding you to account for that now because we haven't made as much progress as we should.
Chris, thank you. We're running out of our normal time, but I'll ask a question to all of you and go Zara, then Will, then Chris. Just what, and the questions has been, what can I do to reduce my emissions? What can I do most effectively as an individual? And there's a number of chat room questions and Q&A. What can I do that can most effectively help the planet survive? Zara first.
I think we need to have that larger scale systemic change. And I think the politicians are treating us as statistics, not people, when they are in a position to actually have that larger scale change. But I will say, even as an academic, we're looking at, where you invest your super, the businesses that you support that can have that larger impact. That's one example, but I will defer to the climate scientist on this, certainly.
Zara, thank you. Will?
Yeah, look, I actually don't like that question very much because it's a collective action problem. It's a societal problem. It's a whole of society problem. It's our values, it's our institutions, it's our systems. We need system change. And that's why I spend a lot of my time in courts trying to stop things, trying to stop politicians doing what they're doing, rather than worrying about my own footprint. I have to say I live in the center of Canberra and don't use a car. So, and we're 100% renewable in Canberra, so I can jump on the light rail, which is run on 100% renewable. So yeah, all right, individuals matter. Individual stuff matters, but the real issue is collective action. We have to change the system. It's the same system that's destroying wildlife. It's the same system that's leading to inequalities amongst ourselves, and it's the same system that's driving increasing fossil fuel usage. We've got to change the system.
So, Chris, over to you, but I'll just throw you a little extra. The major parties have gone soft in Australia. You've mentioned politics. How can we stiffen their spines? How can we give them the courage for change? Perhaps you could address that as part of your answer.
All right, let me go to point number one. And I said it before, make your vote count. You know, if we don't go out and question the candidates standing at this next election, whenever the hell it gets called, then I think we're not being responsible. Go and ask them, what's your agenda? What are you going to be part of here? And that leads into that query about the major parties in the next election, but I'll get to that in a minute. The second thing I would say is we must encourage our young. We have got to get all those old white men out of the parliament, and we have to put a lot of bright, young, enthusiastic and energetic people in there, men and women who are prepared to do the hard yards. You know, I grew up in a climate in this country politically where, you know, you voted for this major party or that major party and you voted like your parents, and that's what we did. That's got to change. I would love to see the next parliament in the House of Representatives being more independent women than there are anybody in the major parties, and force the major parties to then have to do the deals that are necessary to make things happen. Because, you know, I've been really impressed about how the independents come together, and they are together on a lot of these issues. So if you talk to Helen Haynes or to Rebecca Sharkey or Zara Stegel and any of these, they're fantastic, and they know the topic and they know what they want to do. And finally, to come back to the issue, you know, I just think that we have a wonderful country. We need to celebrate that, but it won't be wonderful for very much longer if we don't do something about it. I look around in my role as the chair of a mental health not-for-profit. Why is it that Australia has the second worst mental health record on the planet? I look around and I say, go back to population densities, 5 persons per square kilometre in 2050 versus, you know, 9,291 in Singapore. What is it that's going wrong here? And I think there are a whole bunch of issues associated with our political systems, about the failure of leadership and our failure to hold our leaders to account. I think that's an essential ingredient. We need an integrity commission in the federal parliament. We need to stop corruption. We should stop falling down the ladder under Transparency International, and we should lift Australia up to where New Zealand is, number one. You know, there's a lot to be done, guys, and we, the older people, the grandparents and the parents, need to talk to our kids and get them going.
Chris, thank you. Inspiring, all of you. That's all we have time for, and I'd like to thank our speakers, Will, Chris and Zara, for terrific presentations and answers that I thoroughly enjoyed and found fascinating. To thank you formally, we will plant a tree in your name in a bushfire affected area as part of our Adopt a Tree program, and we'll send you a certificate, and we will keep you up to date with progress of its growth. So thank you again. It's been fantastic having the three of you. Thank you indeed. Over to you, Guy, to guide us through the final section of this webinar.
Many thanks, Jeremy, for chairing, and for Will, Chris and Zara for your wonderful responses. The talks were confronting and scary, but it is information we need to know about. From the responses on the chat line, there are many comments about the excellent quality of all 3 presentations, the need for relentless collective action, and to hold our leaders to account. please join me in thanking the speakers for their amazing talks and give them a good clap at home. Well, our next webinar is scheduled for 6 p.m. on Tuesday, the 10th of May, one to put in your diaries. And as promised, we close out tonight with a short video of Rotarian Rob Edwards interviewing singer-songwriter Rory Phillips, who will provide some interesting insights into writing his song, The Truth, which has been the lead-in song to all our webinars since we started in August 2020. Enjoy.
What's the world gonna be like in 20 years?
When we first put the Climate and Peace Forum together, purely by coincidence, I was sent Rory's video clip of his song, The Truth. So we decided to play it at the beginning of the forum, and we've played the first half of his song at the beginning of every forum since.
What's the world gonna be like in 20 years?
During that time when it was written, Greta Thunberg had burst onto the scene and she was doing all these great things, going to speak to the UN and school strike for climate.
And we are striking because we have done our homework and they have not. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you?
In that moment, seeing a young person who was not much older than me, 15 or 16, it was quite inspiring. I've always seen a lot of activism, but it's always coming from people older than me. So to see a young person tackle those issues was quite inspiring. So I decided to write a song about it.
And again, give us the truth.
It's always good to see older people embracing climate change. There's two camps of people. There's people like you guys, and then there's the old people that are like, well, it's not really affecting us because we're not going to be around, you know, we don't need to worry about it. So let's just sort of pretend it doesn't exist.
I'll give up and just give in.
I certainly hope we can get a move on, to be quite honest. You know, the days of coal power and fossil fuels are coming to an end. I guess I just hope that enough's being done quickly enough to salvage it.
Again and again, give us the truth, don't give us your lies. Don't try to cut us down to your size. People are real, we all feel the pain. When you lie to us again and again, give us the truth.